Thanks so much to all of you joining us for today's online conversation with Amy Julia Becker on Perfectly Human, Why Understanding Disability Matters to All of Us. I'd like to also thank our co-host, Harold Press, as well as our several sponsors who've helped make this program possible. We so appreciate your generosity and support. And we're delighted that so many of you are here today and want to give a special shout out to those of you who are joining us for the very first time. We know there's over 200 first-time registrants for today's online conversation, as well as a few hundred people joining us from all over the world, from at least 25 different countries that we know of, ranging from Canada, and we know there's a big contingent of you all from Canada, so a special shout out, and Costa Rica, to South Africa and Slovakia. So thank you for joining us from across the miles and across the time zones. If you haven't already, let us know where you're joining us from in that chat feature. You'll see that people from all over the world are writing in, and it's always fun to know where people are coming from. If you are one of those many first-time guests or otherwise new to the work of the Trinity Forum, we seek to provide a space for leaders to engage the big questions of life in the context of faith, and to offer programs like this conversation to do so, and ultimately to come to better know the author of the answers. And we hope today's program will be a small taste of that for you today. We live in a time when our value is often assessed and affirmed largely in terms of our productivity. Entire industries are built around pushing us to optimize our output, maximize our results, unlock our potential, break barriers and records, and perform perpetually at peak. The half-hidden assumption of all of this is that we should aspire to function like a well-oiled machine or a bugless piece of code, unstoppable, relentless, and unfailingly effective. Drowned out by the din of such appeals is the simple truth that to be human is to be limited, vulnerable, and mortal. For many of us, such limitations are impossible to ignore. Depending on the source, there's between 42 and 62 million disabled adults in the United States, around 15 to 20% of the country, who live with some sort of hearing, vision, cognitive, mobility, or independent living challenges. Even those of us who may currently feel invincible know somewhere in the back of our mind that if we do not die young, we will grow old and experience the limitations and constraints that old age brings. In a race for peak productive performance, we all eventually lose. And yet, the decline or loss of certain capacities need not stunt and may even spur growth in wisdom, relationship, joy, and love. So what does it mean to be perfectly human? What might understanding disability reveal to us about the meaning of the good life? Our guest today has wrestled with such questions both in print and in person for nearly 2 decades, since the birth of her first child, her daughter Penny, who was diagnosed with Down syndromes, and subsequently upended many of the expectations of her own high-achieving life and assumptions about what the good life actually is. Amy Julia Becker is an award-winning writer and speaker on disability, family, culture, and faith. A graduate of Princeton University and the Princeton Theological Seminary, she's the author of 4 books, including A Good and Perfect Gift, Small Talk, White Picket Fences, her new work To Be Made Well, An Invitation to Wholeness, Healing, and Hope. She also serves as a guest opinion writer for a variety of national publications, including the New York Times, Christianity Today, The Atlantic, Time, and many others, and is the host of the Reimagining the Good Life podcast. Amy Julia, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Cherie, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be a part of this today.
Well, I'm looking forward to it as well. And, I like to start with the story behind the story. And you certainly have a fascinating account of kind of what led you to focus on these topics and write about this. And so I'd love to hear you say just a little bit about the birth of your daughter and how that changed the course of your own life.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, our daughter Penny is now 18 years old. So this was December 30th, 2005. I went into the hospital a couple weeks early, but not in any scary way, to give birth to our first child. My husband and I were both in our late 20s and had had a very typical pregnancy experience. And when Penny was born, she received an 8 out of 10 on her APGAR score, and I held her in my arms and just marveled at this, tiny little body with all of her beautiful features. And then a couple hours later, Penny had been out of the room for a while. A nurse came in and asked my husband to accompany her out of the room. And when he came back, he told me that the doctors suspected that Penny had Down syndrome. And there are two stories from that night that I think might kind of frame our experience with Penny. I was in seminary at the time. I was a student in a Master's of Divinity program at Princeton Seminary. And as it happened, there was another woman, we were in a Romans class together, who also was pregnant at the same time. And as fate or something would have it, she was giving birth to a baby girl in the room next door. And a couple after Penny's, diagnosis had come in to us, her baby was born. And the words that echoed through the walls were, "She's perfect. She's perfect. She's perfect," about this other little girl. And at that time, what I felt like I had been told about my girl, my little baby, was she's not perfect. She's disabled. She has a birth defect. She's got lots of abnormalities. Those were the types of words that either had been said or implied. And later on that night, I was going to sleep and had been awake for almost 24 hours. Obviously, had gotten news I never expected to have. And a nurse came in just to say goodnight and check my vital signs. But as she was leaving the room, she turned back and she said, "I had a special child too." And I said, "How old is your child now?" And she said, "He died a long time ago," which was not what I wanted to hear. And so I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And she shook her head as if I didn't understand what she was trying to tell me. And she said, "He was a gift." And she walked out of the room, and I've never seen her again. But I look back on that night and it really feels like the movement from thinking about not just my daughter, but all of us in terms of perfection, like conforming to an ideal, to gifts that are mysterious and limited and beautiful and filled with possibilities. It was that journey that we needed to take, from perfection to gift, from she's perfect to he was a gift. And that was all, that all happened in the course of a couple hours in a hospital room 18 years ago.
Oh, well, let me ask you about that journey, because you've written quite a bit about it. And you said that the news did basically force you to both reimagine the future,
Mm.
but also kind of re-examine what actually matters most. And what changed as a result of that re-examination?
There's a lot that changed. And as you know, I've written a lot of pages about it. So I'll try to be, to try to summarize that in any way would be to say, at first, what I realized, there were two things. I didn't actually have an imagination for our future. I didn't know other families who had children with Down syndrome or other disabilities. I hadn't grown up around other families in that situation. So I really had this fear of the future in a different way than I had when I was pregnant and didn't know that our child had a disability. And then eventually someone gave me a coffee table book that had pictures of families with Down syndrome. And it started to kind of repopulate my imagination. And it wasn't that I thought Penny would be exactly like this little boy who's playing the harmonica or this little girl who's holding hands with her dad, but it just gave me pictures of what might be. And we began to meet people. We began to meet other families and to learn, whether that was the statistical likelihood that she lived longer than I thought she might was, had increased a lot in my lifetime. So there were some real health advances that had happened, but there was also just this sense of being able to imagine a good life for our family and to recognize that there might be something that God really had for us in giving us Penny as she was, and not seeing her as someone who was particularly broken, but actually who, yes, had more visible limits that would be more prevalent perhaps for her entire life, and yet that were also not different in category than mine, that they were human limits and that I also had human limits. And then the other thing that I would say happened early on is what I would call ugly grief, that I had to confront prejudices that I didn't know that I had. I didn't know that I carried with me a hierarchy of people in which I gave higher status to those who were intellectually kind of super able. And for a long time, I had to grieve a hypothetical child. Like I grieved the loss of the child I thought I was going to be given. But what was really beautiful about that was that once I kind of recognized and received Penny as the gift that we were given, there had never been another child. Like wasn't grieving something that was real or someone who was real. And so I was able to receive her and truly have that experience of movement from grief to joy, which we don't have when someone we love, when we lose them. In this case, I only received, but I had to go through a process of ugly grief to get there. And then to finally, the last thing I will say is I think I began by assuming that having a child with a disability would mean that my world became very small because I was only connected to other people in the disability community, and I was thinking about and working on that all the time, and it was going to cut everything else off. And what I found instead was that it just opened me up. It opened my heart up to other experiences and other people, to a much wider understanding of the way that humans can be in the world and the ways in which we need each other. So instead of seeing, I think for the early years of Penny's life, I saw myself, who I have always been in a position of relative privilege within our society. And I wanted to break down barriers so that Penny could come in and be like me. And over time, I recognized that actually I wanted to break down barriers so that I could go out and be with her. And with the other people who were where she was, because there was such a richness and a depth and a gift in that giving and receiving, and really different set of values than what I had grown up thinking were what mattered most. That really changed.
Yeah. Oh, I'd love to explore that a little bit more. But first, I wanted to ask you, you used the word broken
Mm,
to describe yeah, a word that was like used with you to describe Penny at one point. And the subtitle of this conversation is why understanding disability kind of matters to all of us.
yeah.
And I want to ask you about what disability actually is. Presumably, it is not brokenness, but how do we understand it? I mean, is it something that is malfunction? Or do you see it more
Mm.
as vulnerability? How do you understand the term?
Yeah, I agree with, like, when Penny was first born, I definitely thought disability equals brokenness. And I thought that brokenness was either sad or bad, but certainly negative. And it took a long time for me to recognize that brokenness and limitations are not the same thing. And that was the beginning of an opening to a different understanding, not just of disability, but actually, I think, of our humanity. Because when I started to realize that brokenness and limitations are not the same, all of us as humans have both of those things. I really believe in our bodies, our minds, and our spirits. We certainly are not living in an ideal state. And yet the brokenness that we experience in our world is often because of sin in the world. The limitations we experience are not. If we look back again from a position of faith to the ideal human, whether that we look back to Adam and Eve in the Bible or we look to Jesus, we see humans with limitations who needed to sleep, who needed friendship, who needed to eat, who had needs and vulnerabilities. And that actually is like part of what makes them human. And so to see disability in terms of brokenness is to really misunderstand, I think, this idea of human limitation. Um, Also to misunderstand ourselves as beloved, as ones who do not need to go back to your introduction to produce or perform in order to be acceptable to God for certain, but even to one another. But instead to be able to actually start from a place of belovedness and move into the world from that place with our limitations, but also with an assumption that we have gifts to offer, which might look really, really different from one person to the next. And, we live in a culture in which the gift of being able to get on a screen and speak in a very clear way is highly valued. And there are other things that really aren't. And yet I don't believe that is, those are the right measures. And so, yeah, for me, disability is a pretty natural part of the human condition. As you mentioned, we will all, if we grow old, experience disability in some capacity. And even for those of us who won't experience that, one of the things that I've come to believe is that disability is like a magnifying glass that helps us to see more clearly the human condition, that we are vulnerable, limited, broken, all words you've used, but also beautiful, blessed, and beloved. Yeah, I'll stop there for now.
No, that's great. And actually, I want to ask you more about the words that you just mentioned, and that you're a writer. You take words very seriously.
Mhm.
Just in the course of doing some research before this conversation, I noticed you were quite critical of one New York Times columnist,
Mm,
essentially conflation of disability with suffering.
yeah.
And one of the things that I have sort of noticed in a lot of, kind of the predominance of language used, just in a lot of public rhetoric, particularly a lot of political rhetoric, is it's either the language of commerce or the language of domination.
Mm,
And it seems like you have sort of doubled down on the language of sort of belonging and belovedness and done so very consciously.
yeah.
So I kind of wanted to ask you about um, why it is so important to get our language right as we think about limitation and vulnerability. And how does the language we use actually kind of affect our own assumptions about what it means to be human?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I certainly am someone who's on the far end of caring about language, and so I want, and I have over time been, I think, become a lot more gracious in terms of not writing people off who, in my mind, don't use the right language. And I know from my own experience, when I first gave birth to Penny, I literally was aware that I did not know how to speak about having a child with Down syndrome. And it's confusing. I'm sure people feel this way that there are, am I supposed to say child with Down syndrome? Am I supposed to say disabled person? And there's even some debate within the disability community about that. So it can feel like I'm only going to stumble. How can I say anything? And I certainly would rather have that posture of humility of I'm not quite sure what to say here, but I want to engage in conversation than feeling like, oh my gosh, if I say it wrong, then I'm not allowed to, be a part of this dialogue. At the same time, I also began to realize that the reason for the debate is real. That for people who said, "Oh, I hear you have a Downs baby," which I heard a lot. I still hear people refer to Penny as a Downs child, as opposed to a child with Down syndrome. Um, there was a difference in terms of what the emphasis was as far as her personhood and her humanity. And it really did matter. And I do think that our language both shapes reality and is shaped by the realities that we live in. And so being careful with our language and even asking questions when I think there are lots of terms related to disability that get used in public. The R word is one that has been, in many cases, excised, and yet people still say, "Oh, that's so lame," or "I was blind too." And I think just asking the question, what am I saying when I use these words that are related to disability? Am I creating a hierarchy of value? Am I playing into that unintentionally? And is there a way in which, again, with grace and compassion, I could question myself and perhaps do differently? The one word that I do take a great issue with, which is what you're referring to as far as a New York Times columnist, is the idea of suffering from a disability. There can be suffering related to disability, and let's not pretend that's not true. And yet conflating those two words, I think, is actually just false. Penny has experienced very little suffering, certainly. Well, if we say much of the suffering she has experienced for having Down syndrome has come from societal expectations or norms placed upon her, whether that's like exclusion from, friendships or from just having a hard time participating in groups. not suffering that comes in some sort of, oh gosh, she's been, hospitalized many times or has experienced pain in those types of ways. So I think it's important for us to, be careful in lots of different ways when it comes to language, because we want to be filled with receptivity to one another as humans.
Mhm. In some of your earlier writings, you talked a lot about belovedness and belonging as being, a sense of better understanding of them, one of the gifts of loving a child with Downs. And in your most recent book, To Be Made Well, you actually draw a connection between belovedness and belonging, and healing.
Mm.
And you talked about the way that Jesus was not only constantly healing, but in doing so, he tends to name the belovedness, and reinforce the belonging of those he healed.
Mhm.
And I'd be interested in what you see as the connection between the two.
Yeah. So, I mean, in To Be Made Well, I'm looking at a story from Mark chapter 5. I'm sure many people are familiar with this story. It's a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years who encounters Jesus, and touches the hem of his cloak and experiences, actually the flow of blood stops. And so many of us would say that's when her healing is also complete. And yet Jesus then insists that she come and speak to him face to face. And when she does, he calls her daughter, which is a really significant term, both in the context of the story. Jesus has been interrupted on his way to a prominent religious official, Jairus's house, where he's been asked to heal Jairus's daughter. And so, in calling this woman, this outcast, bleeding, poor, helpless, and probably, and honestly ashamed, we know she's trembling with fear when she comes before Jesus. In calling her daughter, he is, I think, naming her belovedness, and not just her belovedness to him, but to God the Father. And really making this kind of implicit comparison between Jairus's love for his daughter and God's love for this woman. So there's this public proclamation of her belovedness. Um, and then there's also, he is doing the public part of that is this reincorporation into the community, in being able to say, not only has she been made well, but he actually says, your faith has made you well, which is kind of bizarre because we know that she reached out her hand to touch him, and that's when her bleeding stopped. And yet he almost doubles down on like honoring her and lifting her up and elevating her status, which again, we see throughout scripture, this idea that God lifts up the lowly. He humbles the proud, but I don't think he does that in order that they might go to the back of the line, so much as to say, we really want, instead of creating these hierarchies of status in which some people are striving and it's working to get ahead and other people are left in the dust, there's really a sense of the elevation of humans because of our common belovedness. And then the belonging piece is that we are meant to be in relationship with God and with one another. And so Jesus is constantly, it's not just in Mark 5, constantly, whether it's the healing stories or even just his interactions with someone like Zacchaeus, or the woman who falls at his feet and washes his feet with her tears. There's very much a sense of wanting not only to heal in the physical sense, but very much so in both a spiritual sense and a communal sense, in saying part of the healing is being reconnected. And I think we see that right now. We are in what we're calling an epidemic of loneliness. And there are actual physical health complications that are coming. And obviously, there's a mental health crisis that is coming alongside that loneliness. So there is a sense of us needing to know that we are beloved and knowing that we belong, that we are a part of a community that doesn't just welcome or include us, but that actually needs us in some capacity. There's something that we get to give, as well as obviously something that we get to receive by being a part of communities and relationships.
Yeah. And just along those lines, obviously with many disabilities, as well as many physical illnesses, physical cure is not necessarily possible. And in that case, do you see the healing involved being that of connectedness, or is there more to it?
I think there's a both and. So what's Interesting. I mean, so, to be made well is really a book that's exploring this concept of healing and exploring it in the context of people who do experience chronic pain, chronic illness, disability that doesn't change. What does it mean to say that Jesus is a healer in that context? And I do think that the spiritual restoration and communal connection is of higher value and importance to God than physical curing. There's a man named Brian Brock who I really appreciate. He is a theologian in disability studies, and he writes about his son, his son Adam, who has an autism and Down syndrome diagnosis. And Brian writes that Adam is the healthiest person he knows. And he's being a little provocative in saying that, but what he's also saying is that Adam is the person who lives in the presence of God more than anyone else he knows. And that health, it really comes from the word wholeness. And what does it mean to be whole? It means to be in right relationship with God and with our neighbor. I'll tell one other story. When Penny was first born, I have a friend who has cerebral palsy and uses canes to walk. And I was talking with her and I was trying to kind of parse through a lot of these questions and was thinking about, will Penny have Down syndrome in heaven? Like, is this a permanent aspect of who she is, or is it something that's going to be healed essentially? And so I asked my friend Jess if she thinks that she will walk with canes when she gets to heaven. And she said, I've never thought about that before, which in some ways was all the answer I needed, because that to her was just not the top of the list. What she knew was she would be in the presence of love, that she would be seeing Jesus face to face, and all would be well. And again, she wasn't saying, absolutely not, this is my badge of honor, but it was not the animating question. And it helped me to recognize that I have seen human, even from a Christian perspective, like an ideal human as like a superhero who could do everything for myself and by myself, which is actually like antithetical to the biblical vision of what it means to be human, which is to be in relationship with God and with one another. And so that was very transformative for me in terms of starting to think differently about what it means to be made well, and that I needed to be made well, honestly, far more than my infant daughter did. That's for sure.
It can be both comforting as well as inspiring to think about disability or just our human vulnerability as an opportunity to actually re-examine and to better know both our own, connectedness or need for belonging and belovedness. But it can also, I imagine, be very difficult, in the day-to-day, whether one is dealing with just the constraints of disability, or the difficulty of caring for someone with disability. What do you say, having walked this road for almost 2 decades now, to those who are either just frustrated to the core by their own limitations, or the responsibility of caring for them? And kind of relatedly, I'd be interested in like what spiritual disciplines you engage in as you walk this road, to be able to heal yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And there are different stages of our human experience, right? Whether that is if you are a mom of a young child who has like significant medical needs, those spiritual disciplines are probably going to look very different than my situation right now, which is that like I have to wake my children up in the morning because they don't want to get out of bed. So I can get up ahead of them and have kind of whatever time I need. So certainly there's going to be a sense of needing to adapt whatever I say to your situation. And yet I do go back to that receiving belovedness as the starting point. And for me, that really does look like a prayer practice of receiving belovedness. And I do that in a couple of different ways. Even before getting on this call, I could feel that I was just a little bit amped up and thinking that I needed to produce and perform. And I set a timer for 5 minutes and I closed my eyes and I put my hands on my heart. And when I breathed in, I used the word beloved. And when I breathed out, I used the word fear. Like, I'm going to breathe in the love of God, and I'm going to breathe out the fear that I have that I won't be good enough. And that is something I do regularly in the morning, just as a way of like sitting before God. So that's one practice that I think is also related to just how do we get through. The other thing I would say is just, yeah, finding people. And that might be only possible through the internet, depending on where you live, whether that's finding groups of people who have the same diagnosis as you do or as your child does, and getting practical support. Penny has just turned 18, and one of the great stresses for me about that was deciding whether or not we would become her guardians or whether we would allow her to be an adult in the eyes of the law. And I didn't know what to do. And I wrote a little bit about this online, and three people who I've never met in person privately messaged me and said, I've walked that road. I'd love to have a conversation with you. One of them had petitioned for guardian, one had not. One was a special education teacher who'd just been to a seminar and said, I think I have some materials that might help. But it was a beautiful example of the ways in which we can help one another. And there wasn't a right answer there, but there were people who were willing to guide me along that way. So receiving belovedness, finding your people, in terms of being able to ask practical questions, but then just also finding people. I think, yeah, there is usually more time involved in whether it's having a child with a disability or having a disability. Like, it just takes time. And we often, sometimes we want to pretend like that's not true, but it is. And I think that, especially for people within the church, like being willing to give of ourselves when we have time to give, and being able to and willing to ask that of others, whether that's time to pray, time to, yeah, bring a baked chicken, or whether it's, you know what, I've got a child who needs me, I can't bring the baked chicken, and you don't need to feel guilt about that. So there's some practicality to that as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we're going to turn to questions from our viewers. And if you are one of those first-time registrants, you can ask a question in the Q&A feature. I see so many questions have come in. We can't get to them all, but we'll try to select a cross-section for Amy Julia. So our first question comes from an anonymous attendee who asks, can you speak to how the church has historically understood and treated disability?
Yes, it is. I could answer you any way I wanted, which is to say, the church as a whole has done a beautiful job and a horrible job in different times and different places when it comes to disability, which is so interesting. So again, I mentioned Brian Brock, and he has written a book called Wondrously Wounded, which is pretty dense and theological. But I love it because he went back to the early Christians and looked at how they treated disability. And the early church fathers, he really starts with Augustine and says, you know, Augustine said, the Greek and Roman understanding of a child who was born with a disability was that they were horrors. I mean, just that they really, in many cases, might be left to die, exposed to the elements. And the Christians knew that God valued life, but they were still trying to figure out, again, back to that question of like, but is this a particularly broken aspect of creation? And should we understand these children that way? And Augustine says, just because we don't know the answer to that question doesn't mean that we should assume we understand. If anything, we are inclined to value the wrong things. We value strength, we value the way people look, and we know that God values the heart. And so he termed babies, they were talking about babies with disabilities, marvelous rarities. Like, we don't know what's going on here, but we're going to assume they are a wonder of God's creation. And we're just going to operate from that place. I think that would be a good word for the church in general. Certainly, there have been churches that have also, you know, played into even like the eugenics movement in the United States in the 1920s, which was definitely really against people with disabilities and pro-sterilization and all sorts of things. And I think the way in which both we talk about euthanasia and prenatal testing can all relate to how we think about people with disabilities. But I will say there are a lot of churches and nonprofit faith-based organizations that are proclaiming a message of belovedness and belonging and wanting to really extend welcome and honor to people with disabilities today, at least, well, in the United States and in some places around the world.
So I want to combine two questions that really kind of pertain to how do we get to the point of kind of truly seeing children with disabilities as whatever you said, beautiful rarities. I love that. So an anonymous attendee asked, have you known people who have displayed an ability to value human beings without reference to their capabilities? If so, how do they get to be that way? And somewhat relatedly, Kristen Cam asked, can you expand on what the process of recognizing your own prejudices was like? I don't want someone's disability to be the first thing I recognize about them, but that's often the case. I want to see their whole humanity.
Those are such great questions, and I'll do my best to try to hold all of that and answer it. Gosh, what came to mind in terms of have you seen someone or people who can just receive not based on capabilities? Yes, like people with Down syndrome are very often able to receive others without that type of hierarchical judgment. I remember speaking to a group of high school students who were at like a very elite high school doing a lot of like perform and achieve work. And I was telling them about Penny, and I asked them just to imagine having someone in their life who cared about them, not because of their SAT scores or the varsity sports that they were playing, but because of the things they enjoyed doing in their spare time, because of who they were. And the number of kids who started crying just in the thought of being valued as they were and not for what they did was really startling to me, and yet also rang true. And my friend Heather Avis, who is in charge of the Lucky Few Foundation, which is just something for those of you who are interested in these things to look up. She has two children with Down syndrome, and one of the things she's talked about is that well, one of the things we've talked about together is the lack of ego associated with at least the people we know with Down syndrome, that there just is not ego. That doesn't mean there's not any sense of self-esteem, but there's just not a sense of needing to be better than someone else. The last thing I'll say is we go to a camp called Hope Heals in the summer, and there's a talent show at Hope Heals, and it's all people with disabilities who are displaying their talents in whatever way. And this summer, there was a group of middle school boys who led the cheering at this talent show. And to see these boys who I think typically would be the most likely to cut someone down in order to display how cool they were, to see them leading the cheering, which lifted everyone up, it gave me this sense of, yeah, again, like what God wants to do in getting us to see each other on a level playing field instead of in that hierarchical way. He wants to lift us all up and not push some to the bottom and raise others to the top. But when we try to do that for ourselves, that's what ends up happening. All right, so now I'm going to try to turn to the second question as far as how was that about how things changed in me, like how I kind of saw my own prejudices. That's been a long process. And I think naming one of the things that I have come to believe about healing and wholeness is that honesty, humility, and hope lead to healing. So that sense of just what you said in your question, like, I don't like this about myself, but it's true. That's a huge statement of honesty, but also of humility. Like, I need help, and help can come by like reading things, and it can come by forming friendships, and it can come by praying about change. But that admission of honesty and humility is what will lead to a hopeful like movement of transformation that might take a long time. I mean, again, I've had Penny in my life for 18 years, and there are still times where I can find myself slipping into a judgmental or hierarchical model, or again, seeing someone's disability rather than them as a whole person. But I do think that honesty, humility, hope, that's really a helpful sense of like the movement of God's spirit within me leading towards wholeness. And I would also say it's a spiral, like it's not a straight line. It's like honesty, humility, hope, and again, but we're moving, and we're moving. We're just not like rocketing upwards.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to continue to combine a few questions just because there's so many good ones, and there's two of them that are on language. So Sally Quinn asks, you use the term disability. My son is learning, quote, disabled, but he hates that term, and
Mm.
he uses learning different. How do you feel about that? And then,
Yeah. Yep.
well,
Sorry.
why don't we just ask Sally, then we'll go on to the next one about
Okay,
language.
sorry. I don't love the term disability, and I use it daily because I've come to peace with it simply because it is actually like a um, medical and governmental designation that is necessary in terms of recognizing what supports and services people deserve and are entitled to. And also because there is a movement within the disability rights community for saying, yeah, you know what, I can claim this as a part of my identity and not be, and I don't need to be ashamed about it. And I believe that is true. What I don't like about it is implicit in the language is this idea that you are not, I mean, you know, a disabled vehicle is one that can't go down the road. And that's just like not a helpful or true comparison at all. So I would completely honor your son in wanting to say learning difference, because I think that's actually probably more accurate. But I do use the word disabled and disability because of both the identity and the like technicality behind the term.
Mhm. Makes sense. So, somewhat relatedly, Claire Thiel asked, when we hear people speaking in the way you mentioned, quote, I was blind to that or that's lame, how do you suggest that we approach these situations? How can people who are not a part of the disabled community support the disabled community?
Yeah, you know, that's a great question. I find myself still sometimes using that language. So again, I think grace to ourselves and to others is important, starting with ourselves as far as examining language. And perhaps even in a conversation like that, being like, you know, I've been thinking about that term. And it's made me, and I've realized I use it with somewhat thoughtlessly if I'm considering what it might feel like to be someone who uses a wheelchair. And you might get mocked for that. And in most conversations, I do feel like you're knocking on the door of someone's house and they might come to the door and then slam it in your face, at which point usually you walk away. Like it's not your job to police other people's language. And yet it might be an opportunity for a conversation where you get invited into the living room and you sit down and talk about it. So I think grace, self-examination, and curiosity as opposed to condemnation are generally, and again, when Penny was younger, not the words lame and blind in my case, but there when people talked in terms that were really hard for me, I felt, I mean, defensive. I wanted to cry. It was so hard. So that's really different than where I am now. I just don't have that same reaction. And so I just also want to say, if you're in a place where some of that language just like cuts really deep, again, just like to be gentle and careful with yourself is also really important.
So our next question comes from Ann Custer, and Ann asks, she says, I have a 4-year-old daughter with Down syndrome, and your book was really instrumental in processing our diagnosis. Thank you for that. She says, I am wondering, as Penny grew up, how you spoke with her about her own Down syndrome and how you have talked about it with your other children.
Yeah, that's a great question, and something we really had to think about a lot in the beginning, especially because we did not have a prenatal diagnosis. When Penny was born, we were sad and it was scary and it was hard. And I really wish that that weren't true. I really wish that I could say, we just celebrated your birth. And I know people who've been able to do that with their children with Down syndrome. Um, but we decided that we, with all of our kids, including Penny, want to use the language of disability and Down syndrome. The two things I say are neutralize and normalize, so that we're not shying away from that language. And we are also trying to use disability as a neutral term. So one of the things we do a lot in our household is talk about the challenges and the gifts that we all face, recognizing that there are different challenges and different gifts. And those have led to some really helpful conversations with me with Penny, but also with our son and with our other daughter. And then on the normalizing, I think, you know, I remember when our son was 3 years old and he was like, Mom, I know what down means, but what does syndrome mean? Like he didn't even understand, syndrome, like he didn't know what we were talking about. And we
Mhm.
had this conversation and we were talking about disability and we're talking about Down syndrome. And of course, I'm like, he doesn't know what chromosomal abnormality means either. He doesn't know what extra chromosome means. Like, there's no language that's going to work here. And I remember saying, well, she has an extra part to her. And it was like, what? And I said, well, it makes her special. And he's like, I want to be special. I did so many things that didn't help at all. But then finally, he had a little girl in his preschool classroom who probably was on the autism spectrum. And we were talking about her, and he just talked about how she sometimes cried a lot and threw things. And it kind of felt like this opportunity for me to be like, okay, so I can either say, oh gosh, life must be really hard for her. You need to be a good special friend, which would not be a bad thing. But again, it felt like I was be starting a hierarchy in which he is the one who is strong and capable, and she is the one who is weak and vulnerable. And what if there were strengths and capabilities that they both had, as well as weaknesses and vulnerabilities? So I said to him, I was like, oh, okay, well, do you ever notice anything that she really likes to do? And he was able to talk about that. And are there ever any things in your classroom that are frustrating and hard for you, even if you don't respond in the same way? Yes. And so again, it kind of normalized and neutralized the idea that we all approach situations and life with both challenges and gifts to offer. So that's been, my framework from really early on, and it still is, even with teenagers.
Yeah. Someone along those lines, David Sitzer, asked, what are some ways that people relate to your daughter that make you especially grateful?
Mm. That's a great question. And I think she would agree here. Speaking to her directly rather than assuming that I need to speak for her, um, is an honoring thing, and that is true for people who are not able to communicate verbally as well. Penny is able to communicate verbally, but there are many people with disabilities who cannot, and that doesn't mean that they don't really appreciate eye contact and being addressed and communicated with, even if it's not through language. So that would be one thing. And I think the kind of assuming possibility, so whether that is her, I remember when she was going on to the swim team, she wanted to be on the swim team when she was in middle school. And I got a call from her occupational therapist through the school ahead of time who said, is it going to be challenging for Penny to put on a bathing suit? I want to anticipate this because I don't want her to feel left out in the locker room. Her mother, had not begun to think about that. I mean, it was so kind for this woman to be like, I'm just thinking ahead to what might be challenging for Penny so that we can really make sure that she's in an environment that's like safe and fun and good for her. So those are two little examples. There are plenty more I could offer, but that sense of anticipating need, but at the same time, sorry, last thing. There's a concept that I've learned about in this past year called the dignity of risk. And so also not jumping in and doing things for her that she can do for herself. And there's obviously a fine line between anticipating need and the dignity of risk. And then also, again, just that sense of like communicating with her as an individual and not assuming that I or someone else need to mediate that.
Yeah, that's great. So our next question is from an anonymous viewer who asked, our first child was born with Down syndrome last year. He is a gift. We plan to have more children, but I'm nervous about what it will be like to have a younger child, quote, surpass their older sibling in learning or physical ability or whatever. Can you speak to how you dealt with raising Penny as an oldest sibling?
Yes, that's a great question. I'm not sure anyone's asked me that before. I think what's interesting is that for a long time, Marilee and William did not really see Penny as disabled because she was their big sister. And I remember when William started to actually have both, he's over a foot taller than his big sister. And when he started to be taller and stronger and, kind of capable of different things, and especially in terms of math, than she was. And that was a little bit confusing to him. And yet again, that's where we just tried to use the like normalize, neutralize, like we can talk about this, and it doesn't mean she's not your big sister. So I think for them, and the other thing I will say actually before I get to that is Marilyn and William keep Penny in her place in a positive sense. I am much more likely to do things for Penny than I am for Marilyn and William, because I know it will take Penny longer to get things done. And they will have none of that. Like if they're unloading the dishwasher, so is she. And Marilee, it's like if Penny has not done her kitty litter duties, then there's no way she's doing it for her. And so there is a sense of like the very much we're not letting our big sister get off the hook from family chores, and Penny's capable of that. This is completely fair. I just tend to jump in ways that I probably shouldn't a lot of the time. So I would say that this has actually been a positive good within our family. And I will also say that I've talked to other siblings, adult siblings of people with Down syndrome. And I remember talking to a woman named Jenny Newberry. She runs an organization called Camp Pals and has a younger brother with Down syndrome. Um, and I asked her about like kind of, for me, there was a before and after, which you all have heard about, right? It was almost like a conversion experience where I can tell you what I was like before and I can tell you what I was like after. And I remember talking to Jenny and she was like, no, it's just like I was born into this. And so it's so comfortable and familiar, and it doesn't mean there's never been a struggle or she's never, been upset with her brother or something like that. But I do think that for siblings to grow up together gives them the gift of each other in this very natural way that does not involve this, at least the same struggles that I've had in terms of identity and what I called ugly grief earlier. So I don't know. For us, I would say it's been really good.
Yeah. So an anonymous attendee asked, have you seen Christian communities that are doing this well? And if so, what can we learn from them?
Yes, I have. I've seen lots of Christian communities doing this well. And I think a lot of it begins with mindset. It begins with an assumption of belovedness and an assumption of giving and receiving. So I think that where we get into trouble, obviously we get into trouble when we want to exclude people with disabilities. I'm guessing that there are very few people on this call who think that's the proper response. What is much more natural, and certainly again with my initial response, is to see disability either as a problem to be fixed or as a tragedy to be cared for. There's a good Christian instinct both towards justice and care. Those are necessary and good. And yet they can distort that sense of mutuality. And so the places that I see that are doing, I think, the best job are ones in which there is a real assumption that if I am someone in a typical body or, typical intellectual capabilities, to assume that in my encounter with someone with a disability or my relationship with them, I'm not only giving, I'm also receiving. I'll just give one short example. There was a woman in our church who had a son with autism, and she was having a really hard time participating in the life of the church. And I remember suggesting to her that she find someone within our church who could come and be with her son once a week in their home so that she could participate in, I think it was a women's Bible study. And she was like, I couldn't give anything back. I don't have money to pay them. I don't have time to go mow their lawn. Like I couldn't return it. And I said, oh no, you're not understanding me. This would be asking God to provide someone where the gift is being with your son. He's the gift. He is the reward. He's the return. And you're right. Not everyone in our church would receive it that way. And so that sense of like trusting that, yes, there's a gift to be received, not simply care to be given, seems really important to me. in these organizations that are doing it well. And a couple that come to mind, there's an organization called Hope Heals, I mentioned, where we participate in camp in the summer. There's an organization called Special Hope Network, which is actually in Zambia. And they are equipping families in the poorest sections of the city of Lusaka who have children with disabilities to really incorporate those children in their families. I love the work that they're doing. There's a place called Reality Ministries in Durham, North Carolina, that's working with adults with disabilities. There's an organization called Friendship House. So I'll just name a few of those if you want to look them up.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, Amy Julia. And in just a moment, I want to give Amy Julia the last word. And before that, a few things just to share with you before we move on to the final word. First, immediately after we conclude today, you'll see an opportunity to take a feedback survey, and we really encourage you to do so. We really appreciate getting your feedback and your thoughts. We read all of these. We do try to incorporate the suggestions into making these ever more valuable. And as a small token of our appreciation for your thoughts, we will send you a code for a free Trinity Forum reading download of your choice. There's a few that we would particularly recommend that serve as aids to kind of go further into this topic of vulnerability and belovedness and belonging, including Babette's Feast by Isak Dinesen, Bright Evening Star by Madeleine L'Engle, Wrestling with God by Simone Weil, Bulletins from Immortality by Emily Dickinson, and Letters from Vincent van Gogh. So we encourage you to accept that invitation and leave us your feedback. Secondly, tomorrow, right around noon, we'll be sending around an email to all of you who registered with a video link as well as a list of further reading recommendations and other resources. So we would love for you to share the link, start a conversation with your friends and family, and be on the lookout for that. In addition, we would love to invite all of you watching to join the Trinity Forum Society, which is the community of people who help advance Trinity Forum's mission of cultivating, curating, and disseminating the best of Christian thought for the common good. There are a number of benefits and advantages to being a member of the Trinity Forum Society. In addition to promoting the work, it also entitles you to a subscription to our quarterly Trinity Forum readings, a subscription to our daily What We're Reading list of curated reading recommendations. And as a special incentive, with your membership or your gift of $100 or more, we will send you a signed copy of Amy Julia Becker's latest book, To Be Made Well. So please avail yourself of that opportunity. We would love to welcome you into the society. In addition, if you are interested in sponsoring a future online conversation like the one today, we would love to hear from you. And you can just indicate that in the follow-up survey or simply email us. Finally, wanted to let you know about a few exciting new online conversations and other events coming up. 2 weeks from today, on March 15th, we'll be hosting Philip Yancey on life, death, poetry, and peace. The week after, we'll be hosting Charlie Peacock and Andy Ashworth on the topic of what matters most. And then in April, we'll be hosting John Inazu on his new book, Learning to Disagree, and the poet Christian Wyman on his wonderful new work, Zero at the Bone. I'll also just flag that we are in the midst of our Lenten podcast series and have our newest episode coming out on Tuesday, featuring Jessica Hooten-Wilson on reading as a spiritual practice. Finally, as promised, Amy Julia, the last word is yours.
All right. 2 things I want to say. One I've said already, but I want to repeat it. That disability is like a magnifying glass that helps us to see our common humanity. We are vulnerable, limited, broken, beautiful, blessed, and beloved. And the second thing, understanding disability invites us to challenge assumptions about what makes life good, proclaim the inherent belovedness of every human being, and envision a world of belonging. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy Julia. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Have a great weekend.